King Arthur. For centuries the hero of the British race. But did he really exist? And does the British race exist? In a recent BBC documentary, the historicity of Arthur is examined. Arthur was actually a figure of romantic literature of the Middle Ages across Western Europe, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries. But his stories were all set in the mythical heroic age of the migration era 900 years earlier. It has been established that there was indeed a settlement here at Tintagel in Cornwall during the time that Arthur is alleged to have been conceived by Uther here. But there is no real evidence Uther or Arthur really existed. Geoffrey of Monmouth's fanciful 12th century work depicted him as a king not only of Britain but also Iceland, Norway, Ireland and France. Obviously untrue, but for many, particularly the Welsh, there has been a desire to imagine him as a real nationalist hero against the English. Ironic, since it is in the Anglo-Norman court that Arthur was made famous and became the romantic figure we know today. Tintagel was a major settlement of the Domnonians, a Celtic people of southwestern Britain. Many of the ruins here date to the 12th century, when Richard Earl of Cornwall built a castle due to the associations the place has with Arthurian myth. But these ruins here are much older, dating to the migration era after the fall of Rome, when the mythical Arthur is said to have fought off invading Anglo-Saxons. However, the BBC documentary alleged that Saxon invasions were smaller and more peaceful than historical sources have indicated. This argument was based partly on genetic evidence, which I feel was wrongly interpreted. What is an Anglo-Saxon? Nobody ever called themselves by this name. When the Angles and Saxons and other Germanic speakers in Britain were first conceived of in the 8th century by Bede as one ethnicity, he termed them in Latin Anglorum, meaning English. This is the name by which we have since been known, the English. And the English by that time were distinguished by their language and their adherence to the Roman Rite rather than schismatic Celtic Christianity of the Brythonic language speakers. Though for about 300 years the Anglo-Saxons were pagan, in contrast to the Britons who were Christian. But they were never able to define themselves by genetics, of course. The Germanic invasions and migrations to Britain took place in the 5th century, yet the Anglo-Saxon period is said to last for 600 years from this time on. Of course, the Germanic and Celtic speakers began mixing immediately, so to term Anglo-Saxon only that DNA which resembles modern continental Germanic DNA is a mistake. For example, are the English, led by Penda the Pagan, who fought the Britons in Exeter in 632, the same as those English, led by Athelstan 300 years later, who evicted the Celtic-speaking inhabitants of the same city and sent them packing for Cornwall? Clearly the Britons and the English had lived side by side for some centuries in that same city prior to the eviction. Would we be able to distinguish the DNA of those two sides by the 10th century? How much Germanic blood could a Celt take on before he ceased to be a Celt, and vice versa? This is not a question that anyone would have asked at the time. English, and by extension British identity, has always been conscious of the fact it is both Germanic and Celtic in blood. Genetic science has not changed anything about the way we understand the British race, as this poem, written over 100 years ago by the Canadian William Wilfred Campbell, demonstrates. Not yours alone the glory of old, of the splendid 1,000 years, of Britain's might and Britain's right, and the brunt of British spears. Not yours alone for the great world round, ready to dare and do, Scot and Celt and Norman and Dane, with the Northman's sinew and heart and brain, and the Northman's courage for blessing or bane, are England's heroes too. North and south and east and west, wherever their triumphs be, their glory goes home to the ocean-girt isle, where the heather blooms and the roses smile, with the green isle under her lee. And if ever the smoke of an alien gun should threaten her iron repose, shoulder to shoulder against the world, face to face with her foes, Scot and Celt and Saxon are one, where the glory of England goes. The BBC programme referred to a fine-scale study of modern British DNA by the Wellcome Trust Centre for Human Genetics in Oxford. Although thorough and revealing, this study did not actually compare modern samples to ancient Celtic or Anglo-Saxon ones. The study produced this map, which demonstrates that modern Britain is divided into distinct genetic clusters in certain regions due to centuries of relative isolation from each other, preventing a nationwide mixing of blood. Peter Donnelly, director of the Trust, said that these groups were partially formed by the arrival of the Germanic peoples in the migration era, but this map and study can't reveal how Anglo-Saxon anyone is because it cannot accurately define Anglo-Saxon, let alone distinguish it. Take a look at this new principal component analysis chart created by Eurogenes, which is focused on the recent genetic drift between Celtic and Germanic language speakers today, and it compares them to ancient DNA samples of British Celtic skeletons from the pre-Roman and the Roman times, as well as DNA from skeletons taken from Anglo-Saxon burials. Unsurprisingly, we can see that the ancient Celts are very close to modern-day Welsh, Scottish and English people, but that the English cluster is bigger and stretches further down from the Celtic area and into the Germanic people, like the Dutch, the Norwegians and the ancient Anglo-Saxons. This shows that some modern English people are very Germanic and others are very Celtic, but everyone is at least a bit of both. Generally, the further east in England you go, the more Germanic people are, genetically. But at the end of the day, any English person is more similar genetically to an Anglo-Saxon or to a Celt than they are to any modern-day Frenchman, Austrian or Spaniard. This is because Anglo-Saxons and Celts were already very similar genetically, even before they intermixed. This principal component analysis chart shows the differences in populations due to different levels of prehistoric genetic admixture. All the red dots represent modern people from the British Isles, the Irish, the English, etc., and all the black dots represent Bell Beaker invaders who took over northwestern Europe 4,500 years ago. As you can see, the modern British, the Celtic Britons, and the Anglo-Saxons all occupy the exact same area as the Bell Beakers from over 4,000 years ago, while modern foreigners from France, Spain, Italy, etc. are all very far away from us. That's because the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons came from the same genetic stock of the late Neolithic, and that's why modern British DNA is the same now as it was 4,500 years ago, regardless of the Anglo-Saxon invasion. Now, whether the Anglo-Saxon invasion was peaceful or violent is still up for debate, but I would argue that no people have ever willingly given up their religion, their land and their language without a fight, and to think otherwise is somewhat naive in my opinion. Another thing the BBC documentary talked about was the importance of Arthur as a heroic figure. It is said in several sources from the Middle Ages that Arthur would one day return to save the Britons from the English, but this myth has since developed in the imagination of British people, not to see Arthur as a returning Welshman to fight away the English, but as a returning British king to defend all the British people from whatever enemies they have. In his book on heroes and hero worship, Thomas Carl wrote about the human need for the hero as an archetypal figure. And people come here to Tintagel from around the world to think about a hero, King Arthur, the hero of the Britons. But to think of him merely as a historical figure, as many do in Celtic romanticism and such, that to think of him merely as a historical figure who fought against the Saxons, ignores the historical significance of the figure of Arthur himself. To the French, to the English, it was a massive part of Middle English literature in the Middle Ages, and to French and German literature and court romance of the Middle Ages. And this wasn't because they identified with the Celts of the 4th century. It's because Arthur, who may never have existed in the 4th century, certainly did exist in the imaginations of all Western European people who engaged with those myths and those legends and those poems and those songs in the 13th and 14th centuries. And that is what Arthur is important. That's how he's important. because in that he embodies the ideal of the perfect man, he embodies exemplary courtly values of the aristocracy, of the nobles of Europe, of the knights, chivalry. And this idea of Arthur as a returning hero to save the Britons in their time of need, he will come back one day. Some people have imagined that in quite literal sense. But what you have to remember is that we see the same motif in Barbarossa, sleeping in the mountains of the Alps, who will return when his people need him. Or even in the Hindu figure of Kalki, the Avenger, who will come back in the point of time. Perhaps even in the figure of Christ, in the second coming. This figure is not to be taken literally as a human who will be resurrected to save mankind, but as the noble force that lies dormant in man to overcome oppression or evil when mankind is, or a certain race is beset by another. Now we can see in Arthur the idea of the Briton fighting against the invading Saxon, but people in Britain have cause to believe in this idea of a dormant super king, and true kingship lies dormant. The respect for that lies dormant in the people, not in the land, but in the people who built the land, who made the land. So Arthur, if you're waiting for him to come back, you have to look to yourself.